out here to do the assignment, Recovery in the Natural Environment, I was excited to come over here to see all of this. And I was exuberant, I was charged up, and I came over here and I found people still grieving and still doing the work. So allow me to just share my excitement about recovery in the natural environment, because that doesn't mean that I don't understand that some people do still have their head down, they're still doing the raking. And I understand that they're still grieving the losses. Coming out here and seeing the people, everybody who lived through the storm and the storm recovery, the people are older. Y'all are like in another lifetime because of what you've experienced. That's what it does to you. You've got this broader perspective now. For the natural environment, my own philosophy is that it's always in a state of recovery. It's always in a state of flux and growth. But the assignment was to look at mitigation efforts and the changes that I saw. So starting with these paintings over here, and I'm just gonna kind of hit a couple of them as I go around the room. They kind of start where Susan is with this pinkish one with the people in front of the lighthouse. That's out on St. George Island. This is the Conservation Corps, which was managed by Franklin's Promise. And these are kids from St. Louis, Missouri, who gave up their spring break to come out here and plant some sea oats. They do a service project every year, and this during spring break. And this is what they chose to do. So Franklin's Promise bought a bunch of sea oats with the help of sponsors, 4,000 sea oats, and 120 kids came over and they planted them all. They were led by people that are trained by Franklin's Promise. And that's got a whole Duke Energy, and it's even some of the BP oil funds are coming to help with that training. So anyway, that particular piece, it meant so much to me because that's where it started. That piece was not actually painted plein air. Instead, I just did sketches and took 1 billion photos. And also worked from the photos and built sketches. So you will see as you thumb through my sketchbook, you'll see sketches. Some of them are from plein air, some of them are from my photos, some of them are from my imagination. But anyway, I'm going to just pass this sketchbook around so you can kind of thumb through it, understanding that there's 30 people here that need to see it. So you get about 1 minute to thumb through it. Anyway, afterwards there were some ladies that were out on the beach doing yoga, and they came up to me as if I was the authority. I was just the only one that was just standing around not planting. And they said, "What are these kids doing?" And I said, "They came from St. Louis and this is their service project." And they got tears in their eyes that kids had come that far to help. Joe Taylor showed me an area right next to this. This area had been planted before, and some of the sea oats survived the surge, but he showed me an area right next to it that had not been planted just last year with sea oats, and it was scarped down 4 feet, and this was still a gradual slope. So that's the starting point. There's where's my toys? Who took my stuff? I had books and weeds and things here.
I was emptying the chair, sorry.
Oh, that's my teaching aids.
Okay. Busy, wasn't I?
Yeah, I need the other lead. Thank you. Thank you for your help. And I need my books too. So these 3 weeks before my residency started, I came over here to see 2 areas that I had painted before, and one was St. Joseph Peninsula State Park, and the other one was St. George Island State Park. Both of the areas were not the same as I had painted. One of the areas was where the breach came through St. Joseph Peninsula. It was no more, those dunes were no more. I went up to St. George Island, flat as a pancake where I had painted a big mama bear of a dune. It wasn't there anymore. I talked to people in both places. The ranger on St. George Island told me that sand actually had blown into the bay on the other side, and then the bay was throwing it up onto the shore. That's how barrier islands move. So that was interesting. But on my way over, I stopped in Mexico Beach, and I found sea oats growing. Whoa, where'd they come from? I knew that beach had been scoured. Well, I found these pieces up by the road. These are from the roots of sea oats. These are part of the rhizomes that grow underground. And about every foot or so, they develop a root ball and a possible sprout. On this one, you can actually see the beginning of a sprout there. Or a root, I don't know which, but it's starting to grow. So I'll just let you look at those. These rhizomes are important because when I got out to St. Joseph Peninsula, the Scarped Dune, which is this painting right back here, it's one of the last ones I did, had rhizomes from the living sea oats coming down with a root ball every foot for 11 feet. That's how these sea oats continue to grow if we don't completely damage them. If we do completely damage them, then we get something like this painting right here, which is Salinas Park. It actually cut in to the park, washed through the park, tore up underneath the gazebos, eroded underneath the slabs, under the covered pavilions, and it made a mess. Exactly where the vehicular traffic goes out onto the beach. And there are no plants growing in that path. That's where it cut in and cut all the way through. So they're doing big repairs there. They bulldozed up the sand to try and create the terrain of the primary dune and the secondary dune again. Those are the kinds of things that I get excited about, though, when I see the new growth happening. So nature takes care of herself if she can. But if she can't, then we end up with a situation like over at Cape San Blas. They have to keep putting the rocks up and rebuilding the road because she wants to come and cut through. That's what happens on that kind of a cape. And a spit is, it'll be cut through and it'll become a barrier island. That's how barrier islands are formed. So that's what she wants to do. So they're going to have to figure out what to do there. They might need to have a bridge sometime. The other thing that happens when nature can't take care of itself is you have things like the death of an oyster industry, where you're not putting enough fresh water down into the bay and it becomes more salty. That brings in the saltwater critters that eat the oysters. So it brings in oyster predators when the water becomes more salty. So that's still going through the courts, but that's where Mother Nature can't take care of herself. And it's taken about 10 or 12 years to hurt that oyster industry, and now it's really starting to show. The oyster bars are dying. I thought an oyster bar was where you ate the oysters and drank beer. Turns out it's where they grow. Okay, so reconnaissance and the beginning of my residency, one of the other things that I watched those kids do was create living shorelines with bagged oyster shells. They did the bagging and they made a bucket brigade, which is what that second painting is, and they placed them. And then the third painting illustrates what happens when you have a living shoreline, and the reason it's called a living shoreline, the sand deposits from the bay on the upside of the oyster bags or the rocks, and then Spartina grass starts to grow. And so this is an example just down from the living shoreline where you've had that kind of accretion and the shoreline's actually expanding. This is around Sawyer Street on St. George Island, on the bay side. Okay, critters. The critters really, they are what made me think of hope. and why I wanted to subtitle this Hope. Because I saw the deer, I saw 2 deer on St. George, the Peninsula State Park, St. Joseph Peninsula, behind Eagle Harbor concession stand. I surprised them. And this one was younger than the other one. It was shorter and you could tell it was younger. But she has a scar on her side. And I almost didn't paint that scar on her side. But first of all, 2 things. I could tell that she was about a yearling, or just under a year old. That means she lived through the storm. So of course the story that I put in my head, well, the scar happened during the storm, you know, and I've got all this drama in my head. But I saw her how many times after that and recognized her because she has that scar on her left side. Anyway, that idea of her having lived through the storm is why I decided that hope would be my theme for this residency. These other 2 were actually over here on the Carabel Pavilion, both the egret in breeding plumage and the 2 pelicans. And one of the pelicans is also in breeding plumage, the one with the pink around its eye and the brown on the back of its neck. All of this kind of thing I learned during my residency. So it was just great fun. And I had never seen the green eyeshadow that this egret has when she's getting her, or his, breeding plumage. I don't know if it's a her or a him. But both of them were over there here in Carabel. I had to come and tell Cal about it so that he could come and look. And so the critters gave me hope. Now, the breach itself, man, that is so impressive to me, that idea that a hurricane would cut a swath 1,000 yards wide through a peninsula. And yet, this book, Living with West Florida Shore, I got this, and it was written in 1984. I had moved here in 1980, and I think I must have got it about a year later. It has every shoreline mapped all the way around the state, and it says whether you've got moderate erosion possibility, or extreme, or low, or high, whatever. And right where that formed, it has PI, potential inlet. So that's been known forever that was likely to be a potential inlet. Well, sure enough, it happened. So anyway, just thought this was interesting when I had that book that long. The other book that I had that I use, and you're welcome to thumb through these if you want, I'm just going to put them up here. Florida's Living Beaches and Living with West Florida Shore. So the breach itself, I had done this painting, and there's this tree here. Later on, I did the painting over there, again with that tree. Well, the tree's not standing up anymore. It's gone. It's tipped over. It's eroded out from underneath its roots. So when I went over there about 3 or 4 weeks before my residency to do the recons, the channel, the breach was no longer 1,000 yards wide. I mean, the channel was not 1,000 yards wide. Out of the 1,000-yard breach, it was probably 100 yards wide. I came back for the first part of my residency, and it was about 50 yards wide, the channel of water. I came back for the second part of my residency, and it was about maybe 30 yards wide. I came back to deliver my art, and it was maybe 15, and right now it's about 10 yards wide. It's amazing how that, and I actually at one point had stood there and watched nature filling that back in, watched that healing and that recovery. I stood right, it had made a bunch of eddies, and they were closing off, and so there was a bunch of little lakes, and I was like, what's going on there? And I went out to the furthest one, and I stood on it, and for 20 minutes, and I watched it build out 4 feet in 20 minutes. There was one day, there was a 20-mile-an-hour wind, and all of that sand had come up to the Gulf, and it was literally 4 feet high, banked up over here. Today, it's flat as a pancake, and there's actually been some water running across it. So anyway, this is my impression of this breach, and it's based on what I saw the last day of my residency. It was foggy, and it was kind of a little surreal, just kind of vague and out there. So I didn't do much details, but it had rained and water had puddled in here. So that, water's always the beginning of life, and there was always the shorebirds just hollering their heads off out on some spits out here on this side, and they're there today. So that's all part of this breach experience. This is in the general vicinity, and it was after that wind had come across and it had put new sand up on this scarped dune. And that's why that one is called Clean Slate. It was a healing, but there's something I want to say about all of this healing, and I think it goes with people too, that underneath it, it's still hurt, it's still damaged. It doesn't have the roots going through it yet, holding it together. And so here we are, all of y'all presenting strong faces and everything, but underneath, it's only just this deep, and that some of that loss and that sorrow is still there. So we still need to be gentle with each other. This is one of the cuts ahead of the breach. There were many cuts, and there are all along the coast, many places where the Gulf cut in, but didn't necessarily sever the land completely. It stopped at the road, or it stopped somewhere and then left a big puddle. So that's one of them. We had a field day where people could come and paint with me, and that was the scene that I chose for that. Behind Maryland is simply the ripples. I was trying to figure out how the ripples went. The sand ripples just like it does in underwater. So all of that, all of this, I was trying to figure out, how does the sand move? How does it heal itself? The energies, the currents, and I'm crazy artist, so I'm going to try and make some kind of a metaphor out of everything as to how it applies to our life. The next painting is my sweet hosts, George and Maggie Jones, their house, and it was just looking back at the sunrise on a day that I went early to the beach, and there was the sun coming up, and it was reflecting off from the sidewalk next to their house, and I thought, I just have to catch that. I started it, but George had been telling me all along, the sun is moving a lot. Every day it moves. And I came back in about, whatever it was, 7 days later to finish my residency. Sure enough, the sun wasn't in the right place anymore, so I had to do some work for that. We've talked about some of these. I think just the scarp, of course, the scarped dune and the roots. The one next to the last here, that somehow is really the picture I have in my head. And I had painted scarped dunes last year and didn't know that's what they were. I just knew that the dunes around here made a funny sharp edge, and what's going on there? Well, that's how we get those sharp edges. So I was actually painting dunes that had been eroded how many years ago, I don't know, but they managed to stay there like that and retain that sharp feeling. Okay, the last couple of paintings have to do with over at East Point, the wildfire at East Point, and recovery in the natural environment. Joe asked me if I might consider doing anything with those as well. And so the first painting with the just the shadowy trees in the background is my impression of the trees that burned out of control, and it was clear that the fire had crowned over and even left some underbrush in places. And crowning is the last thing you want for a fire if you're doing a controlled burn. So that's my saddest painting. That painting is sad to me. It's happy that it has some new growth, but I contrasted it then with this one. If you don't mind, I'm going to just straighten it. I contrasted it with this one, which is my happiest painting, my favorite painting. You can see up in the upper right-hand corner again that there's some burned trees. But these are pitcher plants that I found growing in East, along with grasses that I knew had burned, but it had not killed the roots. The pitcher plants will come back up. They have rhizomes also. So they'll come back up as long as they're not completely damaged. So that's my happy painting at the end of my residency. So, any questions? Does anybody have?
I have a couple questions.
Yes.
I want to know what solvent do you use and what kind of brush? Like turpentine, not turpentine, linseed oil, what
I use a solvent, but it's very, very much more distilled than turpentine, and it's made by one manufacturer. It's made by Gamblin. It's called Gamsol. That's my solvent. So it's distilled a lot more than turpentine, so it doesn't have the smell.
Yeah, but another question, I don't see brushes chalk at all.
You know, typically plein air painters paint very thinly, and so that we can paint with one stroke on top of another. And even with my studio works, I'm still pretty quick in that way. So I paint thinly on purpose.
Dries that quicker?
Yes, and I can lay down a second layer on top of a wet layer and not have it be as likely to pull up the underlying color.
Well, I guess I had to see it because
There are some plein air painters that'll paint very thickly, but I paint pretty thinly, yeah.
Okay.
I won a whole bunch of brushes from Rosemary Brush Company at a plein air South last year, and so I'm using those nice brushes.
My point is that anybody who look at the painting will not figure out if it's oil, acrylic, or what.
Yeah, mine are oils, they're oils.
And the solvent, that's what they look for the solvent, not have no shiny coat.
No, I don't varnish my work. Sometimes I will later, but I like it to set up good before I ever varnish it, if I do. And for that, it's usually only wedding paintings or something that I know is going to be somebody's keepsake that I varnish it. So these are not varnished.
No, I can tell them, okay.
Yeah. I mean, I'd be happy to varnish it for you if you would like it varnished. Anyone else? Okay, well, that's my impression of our recovery in the natural environment, and I see it as very, very hopeful as a continuing process. John Muir said, "Nature is ever at work, building and pulling down, creating and destroying, keeping everything whirling and flowing, allowing no rest, but in rhythmical motion, chasing everything in endless song out of one beautiful form into another." And that's kind of how I feel. You know, you got a rose, the rose comes up, it makes a bud, and it blooms, and when it is starting to wilt and die down, that might very well be the most beautiful time, because that's when the seeds are starting to form. So just because you can't see what's happening doesn't mean that's not beautiful. Doesn't mean that I don't have my own sense of aesthetics, but for the order of things, I like to think of things in that way, that the whole cycle is beautiful. And just because I've got a few wrinkles, hopefully I'm, not damaged goods or any less of a beautiful soul than when I was younger.
It's actually not a question, it's a philosophical comment. I've been thinking I went to Mariana recently and I saw the damage up there. And as I drove around and around, I thought, oh, we can rebuild houses. Houses are going back up. Man can rebuild what man built pretty fast. But nature, you know, it takes a while, these big giant oak trees down, you know, it's depressing and it's sad. But you've helped me to see a little different light, thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, we don't like, endings are hard.
But sometimes we don't see the wildflowers till after they have a burn.
That's-
Sometimes after a burn is just the carpet. of
I think that's the
wildflowers.
message that I'm getting, you know, that these things are coming back. And it's
Yeah.
nice. Thank you for that.
Yeah, I took a nature walk this spring and saw the baby acorns on the oak trees, and I was thinking, there's the cycle coming back again. This breach, I have no idea how long it's been since that last breached. I don't know if it's 1,000 years, I don't know if it's 200 years, but it's a long time, either way. And so, time just, you know, it's just a bigger cycle.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.